Hello, everyone. This is Bentley, and I'm here with my good friend, Robbz, from the Aquarium Guys podcast. And we want to talk about a very special topic to Robbz's heart, which is to say, an invasive species that is relatively recently, in the grand scheme of things, causing a lot of problems in the United States, but kind of all over the place. And that is the New Zealand Mudsnail. So, Robb, give us some background on this delightful little creature.
Well, number one, thank you for having me on. This delightful little creature I found in my community. I'm a host of the Aquarium Guys podcast, and I started seeing my community members post on my Discord. They come on, and I kind of have my self-help form. If you're a content creator, Bentley can attest to this, that day or night, people think that you just live to answer everybody's questions on direct messages. So rather than funnel these questions directly to me, because I have a life, Bentley has a life, we have our communities. Bentley, I know, has his community in YouTube. Subscribe to that, by the way. Me, I have mine in Discord. So on there, I have a large community all around the world that is actually on there pretty well 24 hours a day. They pop on, you have a question, and within a decent amount of time, they can respond to actually even emergent questions. So it's great that people don't ask me, hey, my guppy's dying, come help. So on this Discord of mine, I started seeing people posting a couple different pictures that I'm seeing on different forums, questions of one of my listeners in Alaska, posting about these interesting little snails. And he started posting about them, and they look just like a blonde Malaysian trumpet snail. And for those that don't know Malaysian trumpet snails, they're considered a pest snail for those that don't have sponge filters and planted tanks. They're a asexual snail that easily populate in a tank. They live live birth, and they have very, very hard shells. So they stay small, and they get stuck in your mechanical filter, and that's what really makes them a pest. Otherwise, they don't really harm a terrible amount in your tank. If you have excess waste in food, that's really what causes them to explode and makes them, quote unquote, the pests that breed excessively in your tank. If you have a well-maintained tank, they stay relatively under control, but they'll always be there. So again, looks like a small, blonde, whitish, yellowish Malaysian trumpet snail, commonly referred to as a MTS in the hobby. So that's literally what I put out is like, hey, I don't think I've seen these before, and they're just called, maybe you have the cool new designer blonde Malaysian trumpet snail. Keep me posted, grow them out. I want to see pictures. Let's follow this up. He watched them. They multiplied quite fast in his tank, took pictures, and we were going to do the tests on them, see what it takes to kill Malaysian trumpet snails effectively in the tank. If there's different treatments you can do, if there's pea puffers, he wanted to go through the whole gamut. Well, now while this is happening, I'm seeing random posts here and there, and I'm keeping my eye out for these snails, because if I see something I don't recognize, I'm fascinated immediately. So for months, I keep my eyes out looking for this snail, keeping my eyes peeled, and then I see posts on subreddits, different fish forums, and I see these pop up here and there, and they're just like, actually worse than Malaysian trumpet snails, popping up in mass in aquariums. I don't really see people complaining, but more people like saying, hey, I found this cool snail, maybe it's a mud snail. I do more homework and find this cool, scary trail going to this wonderful treasure trail, from DNR websites to warning signs to a whole breadcrumb of information on this wonderful thing called the New Zealand Mudsnail. Now, in the hobby, we have common names for a lot of different things. Mud snails or pond snails. I don't even remember the normal term for the mud snail that we have in the normal aquarium hobby. I always call mud snails are just those little pest snails that you get on plants, the most common. I'm literally looking it up right now.
Oh, yeah. We've always just called them pond snails or bladder snails.
Bladder, that's the term. Bladder snails, they're just the small snails that have really soft shells. They'll breed, but they won't necessarily take over a tank. They're not nearly as hardy as a Malaysian trumpet snail. That's what people were referring to as like, hey, is this something that they've seen? And they post on forums. And the DNR actually found some of these forums and posted, hey, you have a New Zealand mud snail. Here's how to handle it. So going down this rabbit hole, I'd give you a little background on these guys and how they're affecting the hobby. So the background I'll give you first. When they first showed up, captured in Idaho in the United States, because again, this is where we live, in 1987. First discovered in Idaho and have been propagating there ever since. They've been spreading across the United States in different regions and have certain hot spots across the United States, and have most recently been taking over certain pockets of the Great Lakes area into our neck of the woods here in Minnesota, even going into places where they should have freezed out. So giving you a bit of background on them for living conditions. These, again, are from New Zealand. So you think semi-subtropical climates. They've tested this particular snail to be stable, and when I say stable, living, thriving, in up to 98-degree water, and living all the way down to the point of freezing. So I call that a pretty darn hardy snail. Great news there. They survive eating all the detritus you can possibly imagine. Any organic matter they can really get a hold of. They burrow into any type of substrate. They're very small size. They give live birth. Trying to get in order here on the different life cycle points. They have a swirl shell. They come in two colors, essentially, patterns. They brown all the way to blonde colorations. And I'm going through the list here, making sure I'm not missing anything. They are measured in lab environments, stable up to 45 meters deep, that they can live and thrive. I don't know if you understand how our lakes and streams work. That's probably the depth of, 90+% of the lakes and streams in the United States.
I mean,
easy.
That is, as far as most people are going to be concerned, for like your standard watersheds, whether they are what feed your drinking water, like in the Northwest, we have big river systems that are fed by glaciers and feed our water system. I think there's only one river in all of Washington that might potentially be deeper than that, and it's only at a very small point. And that's the Columbia, and the Columbia is massive, right? I mean, it's not quite, say, like the Mississippi, but it's one of the largest rivers in all of North America, and it'd be the only one who might have spots that are that deep, and I even kind of doubt that, because 45 meters is an extreme amount of depth. And you're talking... that's 120 feet almost, right? No more than that. That's close to 150 feet. Sorry, I can do my math. It's quite a lot.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if it's flowing water, still water. They're going to climb, acclimate, and adapt to those environments. And algae of any type. I said detritus. I just want to make sure that algae is in there. So people aren't just thinking that it's just dead decaying matter. Algae, of course, like any other snail, is their main source of diet. So as long as there's sunshine, they're going to find food, even if there isn't enough scraps that they can find that's dead and decaying. They do well in, especially from our tests, thanks to the gentleman in Alaska from my community, they do well in cleanup. So if you have dead decaying plant matter, they're absolutely going to chew it down. I have not seen them destroy active plant matter. So if you have a planted tank and for some reason you had a snail in there, they're not going to tear apart your delicate crypts, for instance. They're just going to focus on a normal cleanup like a normal snail. But this is not something that I would look forward to having in your tank.
As far as hobbyists are concerned, we're going to get into the truly scary part of water systems here shortly. How are these coming in a way that a hobbyist should be aware of? So
normally, and if you look these up, the people that are bringing these to light is not aquarists. This might be the first time you've ever even heard the term New Zealand Mudsnail. And that's why we're bringing this to the limelight and why I reached out to Bentley. I talked about this on my podcast, and I want to share this with any possible aquarists out there, is because we haven't put enough PR to this. In fact, before I went out to on my own podcast, if you Googled New Zealand Mudsnail and put aquarium as a tag, the only listing you would get is one website, I think somewhere in the UK, that was telling you parameters of how you want to keep them in a tank.
Yeah,
this is not something you want to keep in a tank.
They're trying to teach you
make that
husbandry. They're trying to teach you husbandry.
This is not something you want to keep in a tank. All the other posts, if you look up New Zealand Mudsnail, generally are a plethora of different DNR websites. These are massively invasive. There's not a lot that can be done when they get into a certain area. They are extremely predative. Now, here's the scary, some of the scary parts. I told you some of the details of how they live, but they are, like some snails, like the Malaysian trumpet snail, asexual, meaning they have both parts. They can both carry and female and male. But what makes them unique and more scary, that they're born pregnant. So not only do they, are they asexual, they're born pregnant, but they give live birth. So you have the pinnacle snail that continually around the clock breeds, born pregnant and asexual, really just going to town, pushing out as many of these you can, self-cloning essentially.
Right.
Really scary type of snail. These are found measured in different DNR places where they're just beginning to test the areas where they're just starting to infect. Well, they'll grab a section of sand and dirt in a beach area or in a couple feet into a lake area or a stream. They will take a square foot and a square meter sometimes on these testings, and they'll find easily 80 to 90,000 snails in this measurement on places they're just beginning to infect.
Yeah. And focus on the word thousand. Because of, and there's a picture that has certainly been up by now, but if for some reason I haven't, editor Bentley put it in now. There's this wonderful picture where you can get a context of their size according to, a coin. And don't let that fool you because of how rapidly they can reproduce, as you're saying. Even if they look tiny, the number per square meter that they can effectively infest a local water system is scary. Now, I want to steer back on that part is like, as a hobbyist, right? I mean, the local water system parts are really scary, but how are we going to be looking for these? Like, is it something where there's a particular type of plant that are coming in that tend to have them? Are they being carried by like a fish, or how are we worried about them as far as a hobbyist are concerned?
I completely dodged the question. So the DNR was the first people to really put these statements out, and they, of course, believe that they came on bait, or they were worried about boats and people's feet to do it. So they measured it. When Idaho saw these starting to spread, they did a lot of different campaigns, and they found that it wasn't necessarily people that were bringing in fish or boats or loose plants, which they can have them. They found that the worst thing was them stepping on any wet surface, because we told you the density of these snails. They step down with their shoe, and immediately in the grooves of their shoe carry these snails up, and they transport them with them. And they bring them to another waterway. They bring them down the street. They're now in the swamp. So that was the biggest concern. So Idaho and other states took time to try to put out a PSA and see what household chemicals you can use to stop the spread. They found, out of all the chemicals that we found in a normal grocery store, that Formula 409 was legitimately the only thing they could find to instantly kill the snail on spray. That scares me, one.
Yeah.
And then the aquarium hobby, which, again, there's no one talking about this and how it's starting to spread, is you have places where they have Florida farms, for an example, where they have plant farms. Thank goodness that they do treatments to see if they have pests and whatnot, but it doesn't matter if they do or don't. Imagine that one fisherman came through the area, a section got started, and that's all it takes. Or so they had some sort of culture, an aquarium where someone brought some native species in, then it captures. it is being transferred by plants. That is how we're doing it. So if you're buying it from someone that was in an area that, gathered native species, didn't do a bleaching process, didn't do a chlor dip on their plants, whatever they needed to detoxify these snails, which, because only Formula 409 kills on contact, it's not going to do the job, boys. You're going to transport these snails from a waterway and now spread it through your aquarium hobby. You're going to take this to your local swap. You're going to share this with your buddy down the street. You're going to bring this into the pet store, and the pet store is going to just treat it like, oh, guess what? A blonde MTS. I've never seen that. And because people are so benign, it's not doing anything terrible. They just treat it like a bladder or mud snail, and they move on. These are getting passed around, and no one has any education about them.
Right. And where I would add to this, just thinking about this, right? So the key that we want to pay attention to is us as hobbyists. The simplest fact, because of how pervasive they are, that somebody could walk from one breeding pond or a wild collection point and bring them back into a breeding system that can get into our fish farm system. And by that nature, they can eventually end up in your aquarium. And if you think about this from the long part, if you're somebody who does water changes, you could easily accidentally have one or two of these snails come up during a water change because they're so tiny. And now they're getting pushed out into your water system because they'll go through a waste treatment plant, and everything that's used for waste treatment, they'll probably survive because these things are so hardy. It's kind of terrifying.
So you have a hardy snail, and then you talked about size. So I like to compare that Malaysian trumpet snail we talked about that also gives live birth and is asexual. A Malaysian trumpet snail is a bit more sizable than these snails, that's for sure. They can grow a decent size. Malaysian trumpet snails, when giving live birth, on average, give live birth to a 1 millimeter snail. These guys give it birth to a substantially smaller snail. These found in, like, if you go to a invasive area where they're so dense in that 80,000 per square foot measurement, and that's just beginning. They're fighting for resources. There's not enough calcium in that area. They're all eating off the same detritus, and they're all stunted, but they are still breeding and stunting each other. So they normally are found 4 to 6 millimeters in those areas. And not say that they can't get bigger. It just has to do with how many mouths are there per square foot versus how much food is available to you. So you're going to find those snails getting a lot bigger in the peak of summer, when you're going to have the most algae bloom and content and heat to grow them fastest, versus you're going to find them in the spring or fall. So when they have live birth, substantially smaller than the MTS. So we're talking grains of sand. We're talking microns that they're not going to pass through traditional filter systems. So this is not something that you want to have for an experiment. This is not something that you want to play around with and say, oh, I can dip out and clean my plants with. This is something you need to treat like the bubonic plague.
Do they have any known predators?
So this is where the story, I'm not here for happiness. Normally I'm a happy-go-lucky guy trying to get you in the hobby. I'm doing doom and gloom here, so give me a little bone, right? If you want to see some giggles, you could check out my podcast. As long as you're over 18 and is explicit, don't go in there, kids. But as far as this goes, natural predators in their area, I'm going to pull it up so I'm not paraphrasing here. In New Zealand, a completely different area that we have, which normally New Zealand, if you don't know, never intended to have any actual mammal predators. It's a area that only has birds, snakes, lizards, crustaceans. It never actually had any mammals. So it's a very unique ecosystem. They have things that are there that are nowhere else in the world, much like this snail. So the only thing that really keeps the population down in New Zealand is 11, I always butcher the word, the types of flatworms called trematodes. Trematodes. They're a type of parasitic flatworm. And the life cycle of these things, there's 11 different types that predate on these snails, is the The flatworm attacks the snail. The snail gets eaten by a bird. The bird craps out the snail and the spawn of the flatworms, and so the cycle repeats. So when they're trying to look to see how we can control numbers, California, which has some reason deep pockets for DNR and has a high, probably the worst population of these New Zealand mud snails, and trying to figure out ways of adapting them, are doing research purposes to see if they can use their waterfowl to infect them with these flatworms to see if they can find ways to control them in California.
So, to recap, the only predator is a parasitic worm that is reliant on waterfowl to consume the snail with the worm inside it in order to reproduce.
Now, it's not just that cycle, because the parasitic worm doesn't necessarily eat the snail. They sterilize upon biting. When the parasitic flatworm attacks the snail may live, but the snail is now infertile, capping off of that breeding cycle. So they slow down the population significantly.
Right, but they're not. There's the more terrifying part of it is the fact that there is effectively no predator because it relies so heavily on sterilization from a parasitic worm that needs waterfowl to reproduce. Right. So it basically has to be in a wild environment where you hope that parasitic worm also cannot affect other aquatic species.
And you hope that bird would have not just a taste for it, but it takes kind of a dumb bird. So these particular snails are not gourmet. If they're the size of grains of rice, they're birds that are probably sticking their beaks in the dirt looking for things that aren't those snails and just happening to eat them.
Yeah, like a duck. To catch them. Right.
Right. They're not real smart. They're not going after those snails. In fact, in the areas that DNR do studies on these, they're trying to find maybe there's a native species that naturally goes after snails. There's a lot of different native species in the United States in different areas. I'm in Minnesota that do go after different snail species. And they measure this, and there's not any native species that Idaho, there's a list of states, have found that actually digest these things. They have a foot, much like a trapdoor snail, that allows them to close up, say a fish swallows them up, and the shell is good enough to stop the acidic stomach of a fish digesting them, and they simply pass them through.
Yay.
So if you have them in your tank, even if you have fish that normally go after snails, they have to crush them to do it. And more bad news, we have had people test them with puffer species to limited success. Yeah, if you have bladder snails, Malaysian trumpet snails, mystery snails, if you have rabbit snails, doesn't matter. A snail puffers eat. This snail, they've literally put them in tanks where it's bloomed with them as an experiment, and they've just kind of been ho-hum because they're not that tasty. Now, if you have found that this works out for you, great, share the information, but I would not encourage people to predate this snail as a food source for your puffer for the simple reason of this is a terrible snail to pass along by accident in the hobby.
And also
your local waterway.
They might not be something the puffer will even eat.
Again, I've had a handful of people that have had this and had them with snail loaches and puffers, and they've kind of left them alone just because they've seen them hit them, but then they don't go after them again. Like they've taken a bite, have not enjoyed it, and then moved on with their life.
I'm assuming it's similar with assassin snails, because I bet comments are like, assassin snails immediately, right?
Here's another thing with assassin snails. Assassin snails help control. So sure, if you put a handful of assassin snails, they'll help keep the species down. But I don't know if you've ever had a tank full of Malaysian trumpet snails and threw a handful of assassin snails in there. They don't keep up.
Yeah.
No. You can have 3 assassin snails for every one Malaysian trumpet snail as a starter tank and measure that. They're not going to keep up.
Yeah.
They'll control. They'll help you keep numbers down, but they're not going to do the job.
And the trumpet snails nowhere near as aggressive in its speed of reproduction as these New Zealand mudsnails.
And let's be real here. If you've ever seen an actual adult assassin snail, they're, yay big, half-inch long, inch long. Why are they going to go after a 6 millimeter snail? Or let's say that you had full food size, let's say up to a half-inch snail, when they could go for other things. I mean, it's a snack. They're not going to sit there and waste their time if you have other snails in the tank, but here nor there.
We've got our doom and gloom. They're very difficult to stop. They're very easy to spread unintentionally. They can live through practically everything. So the real question is...
Last piece in the live through practically everything.
Yeah.
One more piece of doom and gloom. People ask, because I did this before and I had my listeners message me. It's like, well, what about, are they, susceptible to disease? Some snails can be susceptible to certain disease. Generally, snails on a whole are very hardy. They're the one thing in your tank that's going to live past your fish. But maybe there's something that could hit this. Minnesota, they're not going to admit to this, has had issues with goldfish in the past in a couple of lakes and streams. They had a scenario where somebody showed up with a couple goldfish in a 10-gallon aquarium. They dumped them in the tank, their tank in a lake, had no connecting body of water, and they had carp herpes. The carp herpes completely wiped out the entire list of carp species in the native lake and stream without affecting the walleye, the northern, the bass, the sunfish, the perch. Didn't touch any of them, but hit every single carp species, the Eurasian carp, the goldfish, everything in there by the thousands. It killed them in a matter of, I think, a week and a half. So, of course, DNR are looking for, is there a disease that would hit snails? This particular snail is very unique in having 3 sets of chromosomes. So, among other snails, this is even hardier and more prone.
Resistant.
What's the word I'm looking for? Resistant to illness and viruses. Thank you. Which make the flatworms so unique in making them sterile.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. Okay, so I mean, I know this answer because the reason why we're having this is we had a hour and a half long phone call while I was running errands, basically.
Bentley, you got to tell these people. Tell the people, Bentley.
And I asked you this very simple question, and I know the answer, but we have to talk about it. Is there any research that people can support to help?
So funny you say this. I actually tried to reach out trying to find experts on my podcast because, again, we're just a couple of fish people that do this as a hobby, much like you guys listening to this. We are not the foremost experts in the New Zealand mudsnail, right? The only reason I'm bringing this to you is because no one else is, all right? And trust me, I've reached out to people trying to make sure someone else could talk about this before me. So the best thing that you can do is reach out to the DNR. The research studies that I have found that have anything to do with this or posted any research papers on this have openly said, this is not my bag, baby. So much to the fact that even when they posted articles about the snail, it's really not there. So in the show notes, I've given Bentley links to Minnesota DNR, Michigan DNR, California DNR, more information about this, and even the government fact sheet that they have, the US Gov website. So if you're looking for somewhere to do this, educate your neighbor about this, share this video with someone to get the word out, especially to aquarists, because fishermen know more about this than us, and help support your local fish and game, because those are where the dollars are going to try to find research on protecting the waterways, putting out the education, and finding ways to address and deal with this.
Yeah, so please support your local Department of Natural Resources, just in case you don't know DNR. It's been on the screen a few times in text, but just in case, we'll say it out loud for those that are treating this like a podcast. And your wildlife fishing game, like if you happen to have ballot measures that are coming up in any level of election, support those, because that's going to help us as a country hobbyist. I mean, hopefully it's happening in more than just our country. I'm sure it is, because these are so pervasive potentially. But support any of your equivalent agencies so that we can hopefully find an answer to these pervasive little bastards, and maybe not have to give you so much doom and gloom in the future.
Right now, the big place that's doing the most research on it is places like the Center for Invasive Species Research in Riverside, California. They have posted articles on it many times, and they're the ones that work with the DNR, have the grants to the DNR that are doing some things. But again, no one owns this species. There's not a guy out there that sits there and says, I'm that guy. It's people in the DNR that have taken it on, that know the damage it's done, and know what it can do when it hits your area.
Yeah,
those are the people that are in the front lines battling this. And trust me, when you say, oh, I'm not so bad in so-and-so neck of the woods, we're just now looking at a couple corners of it. If your guy gets some more information that no one else knows, I promise you all the DNR agents share with each other.
Yeah.
All this information is not in a dark hole because it's in your corner or state. They're immediately putting this out as an APB to California, Michigan, all of these hot spots that are getting hit.
Yeah, and I've shown a map at least once, but we'll have it up again just to show you within the watersheds of the United States where these hotspots are for this particular snail, and you can see it's already affected a surprising number of water systems in the United States. And as Rob has so well put it, no one in our hobby is talking about this. When we had a while back when those zebra mussels were coming in on Marimo mossballs, the hobby as a whole freaked out because it was obvious, here is this thing on this plant that gets regularly purchased. But because this species looks so similar to something that we think is just like, oh, it's just that little Malaysian trumpet snail, they're not so bad. But they could potentially be these mud snails. And there is massive risks if they get into water systems, whether they're already affected by them or not. Just because if they get into a portion that hasn't been hit yet, even though it might be downstream or upstream, it speeds the process in which they can destroy local water systems. And they can be a massive problem for us as hobbyists because there's nothing to predate on them, and they're very difficult to get rid of.
Now, if you have the species, we asked about what you can do. Educate, talk to your DNR, but most importantly, if you see this, take it upon yourself that it ends with you. Don't be the guy that be like, oh, I can handle it. I'm going to start controlling it. I'm going to start squishing the snails. I'm going to start using normal snail controls. I want you to treat yourself like ground zero. Imagine that you have this snail that has 3 chromosomes, is super resistant to disease, that's resistant to all the treatments you're going to try to do, that predates anything that you've had before, right? That can survive through a fish's stomach, that doesn't taste good to the predators that you're going to try to put against it, and that may even get into your sewer system. So when you want to dump that aquarium and you want to take these things that have babies the size of a grain of sand and you want to wash that in your sink, which has a sewer system going to your city that flows right out in the river system, that's not going to get hit by 409 or some other harsh chemical to kill it, you're now flushing that live snail down your waterway potentially. Treat it like ground zero. Bleach the tank out. Get that 409. If you have to sacrifice some plants along the way, make it happen. If you're going to take your fish out, they're small fish, fine. If they're not going to sift through the sand, if they're sand sifters, quarantine them. Wait for the few days it takes to know that they've passed through the system. People have seen these try to get eaten up by fish, pass babies through their system because they won't digest. Treat it like ground zero. Nix the tank. Make sure that you have a clean environment so that you're not a secret spreader. Treat it like it was a COVID when we first started. Put on your metaphorical aquarium mask, brothers. Don't spread it around because this is not going away, and you don't want to be the person to give it to your community.
Yeah, just remember that only in this case is Formula 409 a vaccine. It is not a vaccine for other things on yourself.
It is not, no.
But for the snail, it is the vaccine.
And I promise you, using 409 on anything is like a bleach, and it does not come off well. So if you're going to do it, you're literally sterilizing the unit, and you probably won't. If you have a SpongeBob decor and you're spraying it with 409, SpongeBob decor is probably dead now. Don't put that back in the tank. I don't trust that to come nix chemicals off of it for a very long time.
Keep in mind that like a lot of this was using household cleaners. So hopefully as more and more research comes out, we might find other things. We talked about at one point, there's a particular like tab that you get that's pool strength, basically effectively speaking chlorine, although it's a like alteration of chlorine that is really, really destructive, but it's great for keeping pools sanitary. And we don't know necessarily if that's been tested, but from my experience, the few times you use that in certain dips, like if you dip a plant in that for like 30 seconds, if you go any longer than that, it'll murder the plant. But it's such a heavy oxidizer that it does have a chance to be effective. So, I mean, these are the level of things we're talking about where it's effectively like nuke the site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure. Just because of how survivable and hardy these little bastards are.
And it's not that a snail, like if you think of a snail, that's not that the snail itself couldn't be hit by a chemical. It's that they have that little foot trapdoor like system where they'll close up and you have to penetrate the shell to get to them. Yep. So if you do that chlorine dip, sure, it could kill the creature underneath, but you have to get through the shell is the problem. So how long is it going to take for a chlorine tab to penetrate that shell where a fish's acid in their stomach couldn't dissolve it for a digestive system? That's the stuff you got to think about.
Yeah.
So, and that's how they travel on the shoe. When they go in a traveler's shoe and they get in the grit of your shoe, they close up, they lock up, and they maintain the liquid and water in their shell, and they last for days dry.
Yeah, I think that's the thing we skipped over is they literally can live for days when they close up out of water.
I sent you a Malaysian trumpet snail in a bottle as a joke on a live stream. This one, I'm not going to do this to you, but I mean, I could have just sent it dry and it'd be like, it would have been just fine. It's just crazy to me.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're really hitting this very hard, but they're so pervasive. So, again, Rob, I really want to thank you for your time and helping educate my audience on this dastardly little snail. And for those of you watching, please leave a comment down below. Have you encountered this snail? Did you have no clue this existed, which is probably the more common comment we're going to have? Are you now terrified of the entire world and every snail you're ever going to see that looks vaguely like a Malaysian trumpet snail? Then Rob has done his job, and that's great.
No. Education, sure, not scaring, but I mean, it's going to happen.
If you've enjoyed this, please consider going to see the Aquarium Guys podcast. We'll have a number of links down below between Department of Natural Resource articles, a few other pieces of information on this, and also the Aquarium Guys YouTube channel, because now your podcasts are coming on YouTube as well, correct?
They are. They forced me off of Google Podcasts and back onto this platform, so... Yeah, that's been fun.
With only a little bit of kicking and screaming.
Oh man, I got so much to say off air.
But with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay awesome. Oh, wait, no.
P.S. If you think you have this snail and you want it ID'd, you can find Bentley's community. I'm assuming in the YouTube comments, their community. Where's that link?
It'll be down in the description.
Good. And also my Discord community, you can post your pictures there. We'll happily ID if it is a snail or not. Trust me, we have people, quote unquote, on staff ready to ID your snail for you.
There you go. All right. Now we'll get to it. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching and stay awesome.